Somewhere in occupied Guernsey, in the middle of the war, Florence Hill sat down with a printed form and used part of her 25 permitted words to ask her two eldest sons how tall they had grown. She was not being sentimental. She did not know. Kenneth had been 12 when he left the island. Herbert had been 11. Their mother had not seen either of them since, and would not see them for years yet, and the only instrument she had for finding out anything at all about them was a form with a box on it, roughly the size of one sentence. The form was a Red Cross message. It had begun life as a way for prisoners of war to write to their families, and it had been extended to cover the Channel Islands, because by the summer of 1940, that is what the Channel Islands had become, a place you could not simply write to. 25 words. That was the entire channel. Everything a mother might want to ask her children: where they slept, who fed them, whether they were happy, whether they still sounded like her, had to be cut down until it fitted inside it, and then handed to somebody else to read. What has to happen for a woman to lose track of how tall her own children are? Before any of that, Florence and William Hill kept a grocer's shop in Guernsey. They had 3 sons. Kenneth was the eldest, then Herbert, Bert in the family, and then Billy, who was 5. Guernsey in 1939 was a small island doing what it had always done. It grew tomatoes and sent them to England, and imported almost everything else. Around 40,000 people lived on it. It was British, and it was closer to France than to England. Close enough that on a clear day the French coast was a fact, rather than an idea. William had the shop, and he had his elderly parents on the island. Those two things sat in the middle of every decision the Hills made in the summer of 1940, and they are the reason this story exists at all, because they are the reason William and Florence did not go. In May, Germany invaded France. Islanders gathered round the wireless the way people did, and listened to a war that was moving west at a speed nobody had planned for. On the 17th of June, German forces reached the French coast, 30 miles of water. 2 days later, the local paper carried an announcement, and Florence and William Hill had one evening to decide what to do with their children. The announcement told parents to go to their schools that evening, register their children, and prepare to send them away the next day. Florence and William Hill went. Some schools asked that the child be brought along with the suitcase, so the suitcase could be checked. There is no document recording what was said in the Hills' house that night, and this channel does not invent one. What the record does hold is the shape of the decision, because thousands of families on that island made a version of it inside the same few hours. Teachers were told they would travel with their pupils. Mothers volunteered as helpers. Some schools moved as a whole. Others were broken up, and their children scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. The Hills sent 2. Kenneth, 12, and Herbert, 11, went with the schoolchildren. Billy, 5, stayed. William and Florence stayed with him, with the shop, and with William's parents. Around 17,000 people left Guernsey between the 20th and the 28th of June, close to half the island. 5,000 of them were schoolchildren, and around 1,000 more stayed behind with a dozen teachers, depending on which account you read. Many of the younger ones were told they were going on a school trip, so as not to frighten them. Parents said goodbye at the harbour and told their children they would follow on the next boat. That printed form, with its box the size of a sentence, is in a museum now. So is the chemical streak the censor left across it. These are the things we document on this channel, not the battles, but what a family was permitted to say to itself while the battles went on. If that is worth writing down, subscribe. Back to Guernsey. Kenneth and Herbert Hill were among the 5,000. They went by boat to Weymouth. From Weymouth, they were put onto steam trains, which for a great many Guernsey children were the first trains they had ever seen. Nobody would tell them where they were going. Station names had been taken down across Britain as a precaution against invasion, so the children leaned out of the windows and called to people on the platforms, asking where they were, and the people on the platforms would not answer. They ended up in the north. Guernsey evacuees were sent to the industrial districts of Lancashire, Cheshire, and Yorkshire, with hundreds moved afterwards into Derbyshire and some as far as Glasgow. They spent several weeks in reception centres in Manchester, large halls where arrivals were fed and counted. before local accommodation was found for them. The largest single group, around 2,500 people, settled in Stockport for the rest of the war. It is worth being exact about what these children were looking at. They had come from a rural island of 40,000 people. What they arrived in was smoke, terraced streets, mills, double-decker buses, clogs. We do not know which town the Hill boys were sent to. The record does not say, and we are not going to guess. By the time they were settled, the island behind them was gone. On the 30th of June 1940, 2 days after the last evacuation boat, German forces occupied Guernsey. Florence and William Hill were on the island with their 5-year-old. A Luftwaffe pilot had landed at the airport and found it undefended. Britain had withdrawn its troops and demilitarized the islands, and had not made that clear quickly enough. So the occupation began with bombing, and 44 islanders were killed across Guernsey and Jersey before it was understood that nobody was going to fight for the place. Then the rules arrived. The clocks were moved to German time. Fishing was restricted. Club meetings were restricted. Singing patriotic songs became an offense. Islanders who broke the new laws could be arrested or deported. And the post stopped. That is the part that matters here. There was no postal service between Guernsey and England for the duration of the war. Whatever William and Florence knew about their 2 eldest sons on the 29th of June was, for a while, simply the last thing they knew. Somewhere in the north of England, 2 boys were being shown a bedroom. On the island, their mother was working out that there was now no ordinary way to find out anything about them at all. So how do you write to a child on the other side of that? The answer, for Florence Hill and for thousands of others, was a form. The International Red Cross ran a message service for prisoners of war, and it was extended to cover the Channel Islands. You wrote a short message on a printed form. It went to Red Cross headquarters in Geneva, and from there through the German postal system to the island, or the other way about. The word limit was 20 at first. It was later raised to 25. The route ran through Portugal, Spain and France. A message could take months to arrive. A reply could take 6, and the form was read. On surviving messages there is a blue streak across the paper, a chemical the Germans applied to check for invisible ink. Every message a mother wrote to her children was inspected for the possibility that she was hiding something inside it. One evacuee said afterwards that receiving a Red Cross message was the best present there was, because it meant the person who wrote it had still been alive when they wrote it. That is what the form actually communicated, not the 25 words, the fact of them. Now imagine choosing which 25. So here is what Florence and William Hill actually wrote. In a message from December 1941, they report that everyone is well. They thank a relative for having Bert. They send their love to the boys, and they say they have had no news from them. That is 18 months into the separation. In another, they write to the boys directly. Everyone is well, they say. They tell Bert he has grown tall. They ask what Kenneth's height is now. They say they are relieved to know the boys are happy. They say they are longing for the reunion. And in a third, William's sister, Margaret Sweeney, passes on what she has managed to find out. Bert is fine, living with a Miss Scott, who keeps house for her uncle, and who is lively and plays golf. That is the sum of what William and Florence Hill knew about the woman raising their son. 2 sentences, relayed by a third party, arriving months late. A parent at that end of a system is not being kept in the dark by anyone in particular. They are simply living at the far edge of a machine that was never designed to carry a family. And a person adjusts. You learn to read a great deal into the word fine, and into the word lively, which is a skill. And skills like that do not switch off when the war ends. While that was happening, Kenneth and Herbert Hill were growing up in the north of England. The Guernsey evacuation had a feature most British evacuations did not. Whole schools had moved together, with their teachers, and in some places they were simply reopened. One headmaster restarted his Guernsey school in the parish hall at Cheadle-Hulme, so that his teachers and pupils could stay together. That mattered more than it sounds. It meant many of these children spent the war inside a Guernsey-shaped institution embedded in an English town. Same teachers, same classmates, same accent in the room. And everything outside the door was Stockport. They were looked after. Local families took them in. Guernsey mothers who had come over as helpers organized themselves. They held meetings, and they printed a monthly magazine, 5,000 copies of it, circulated around England to keep scattered islanders in contact with one another. Help arrived from further away as well. One Guernsey school in Cheshire was supported financially by Americans through a sponsorship scheme, and one child there was sponsored by Eleanor Roosevelt. Neighbors brought books and toys because they understood that these children's parents could not send anything. And year by year, without anybody deciding it, the boys were becoming people their parents had not met. The last message William Hill ever sent his sons carries a date, and the date it reached England is the strangest detail in this entire story. We will get to it shortly. It only means anything once you know what the island had become by then. The question about their son's height was written from a place that was closing in. Florence and William Hill spent the occupation on rations. A civilian on Guernsey was getting around 1,350 calories a day between 1941 and 1944, which is below what an adult needs, and in the winter of 1944 and 1945, the ration was cut roughly by half. In September 1942, Hitler ordered the deportation of islanders born on the British mainland, and afterwards of anyone who had at any time served in the Crown's armed forces. More followed in 1943. Around 2,000 Channel Islanders were taken to civil internment camps in Germany. Most of the Guernsey deportees went to Biberach and sat out the war behind wire. So when the Hills wrote that everyone was well, that sentence was doing a great deal of work, and it was doing it under a censor. This is the point where the two halves of this story stop being one life with a gap in the middle. In England, the boys were at school in a room full of Guernsey voices, being brought books by neighbours. On the island, their parents were queuing. The last message William Hill wrote to his sons is dated the 16th of March 1944. That letter, the Hills' last from Guernsey, arrived in the United Kingdom on the 6th of June 1944. The 6th of June 1944 is D-Day. There was no reply. The Allied landings in Northern Europe cut the route those messages travelled, and the channel that had carried 25 words at a time between these parents and these children simply closed. What followed on the island was the worst of it. St. Malo fell in the middle of August, which shut the supply line from Granville on the Normandy coast, the route by which the islands had been fed since 1940. By the end of 1944, food and medicine were effectively gone. In November, the bailiff was permitted to contact the International Red Cross about conditions. The relief ship SS Vega docked on the 27th of December 1944 with parcels and returned several times before the end. People were already dying when it arrived. Guernsey was liberated on the 9th of May 1945. HMS Bulldog took the German surrender, British troops landed, and the island was British again in more than name. Thousands of evacuees in England assumed this meant they were going home. They were wrong, and they were told so in a stadium. On the 3rd of June 1945, 6,000 Channel Island evacuees gathered at Bellevue Stadium in Manchester. Kenneth and Herbert Hill had spent 5 years inside the world that filled those stands. They were told that returning a large number of people to the islands at once would create serious problems of accommodation and employment. So they waited again, and then they went. What is documented about that summer is the pattern around them. Many children who came back found it hard to bond with parents they had not seen in 5 years. Some had come to love their English foster families and did not want to leave. Some found their homes damaged or destroyed. Some could not settle or could not find work and returned to England within months. Some never went back at all, and their families are in the north of England now. And some, when they got home, were told by neighbours that they had been cowards for leaving. Kenneth Hill had left the island as a boy of 12. Herbert had left at 11. Their parents had asked, in writing, how tall they were, and had waited months for an answer that was out of date by the time it arrived. Kenneth and Herbert Hill cannot be traced further in the public record, and we are not going to invent an ending for them. What is documented is that the family was reunited and that both boys came home. What was said in those first weeks is in no document. What remains is what these families told their own children, and some of them are still here to tell it. If you are watching this on a television, pick up your phone and leave us a comment. We read every one. Tell us the name, the island, the town. These children were not asked. Most of them never told anyone what happened next. We write it down. If your family was split by this war, and you know what they were allowed to write to each other, that is exactly the kind of thing that ends up lost, and we would like it not to be. There is one more story we have already started, and it begins on a station platform in Manchester. There is a photograph of Guernsey children standing on the platform at Stockport Station in 1941. They are not arriving. They had arrived a year earlier, and by then the platform was somewhere they went on purpose. Next time, what those 5 years built inside the households that took them in, and what happened in those houses in the summer of 1945.